Now before we do an exercise, I'm going to show you the basics on some basic objects. I'm going to show you how to insert keyframes. Keyframes are simply frames where animation data for an object is saved. For example, if I insert a location keyframe for this cube at frame 1, it records its location. And then if I go up to frame 20 and I move the cube and I insert another location keyframe, it's going to record that new location at frame 20. So when I play the animation from frame 1 to frame 20, it's going to animate the change. Let me show you how to do that. So I have this cube selected, and I'm at frame 1. To insert a keyframe, press the I key, and you have a whole list of choices here. Select Location. So we just recorded this cube's location at frame 1. And you can tell when there's a keyframe on a certain frame by this right here. The name of the object and the frame number next to it will be orange. But say I go to frame 2. Now there's no keyframe set here, so that text is going to be white. That's how you can tell when a keyframe was added to a certain frame. So we inserted the location keyframe at frame 1 for the cube. Let's move ahead to frame 20. And in side view, I'm going to move the cube up and backward. And press the I key again to insert this new location keyframe. So we inserted a keyframe at frame 1 and frame 20. Now let's go back to frame 1 and press Alt and A to play our animation. Press Escape to end it and just play it again. So you'll see it animates the difference from frame 1 to frame 20. So that's how keyframes work. And if you take a look at the keyframe menu, you'll see there's keyframes for rotation, scaling. This is a combination here of location and rotation, location, scale, and just all that stuff. So let's go to frame 1 again. We're at frame 1 now. Let's insert a rotation keyframe along with that. So now we've recorded the location and rotation of the cube at frame 1. Let's go all the way back to frame 20. And just press the R key and rotate that around. Press the I key and insert a rotation keyframe. Now I'm going to use left arrow key and just bring that back to frame 1. And you'll see we now animated our cube. We animated both its location and rotation. And you can throw some scaling animation in there as well if you want. But that's basically how keyframing works. Now there's an alternative to manually inserting keyframes, and that's this little button right here. It's a record button. It will automatically insert keyframes for any changes you make to the object for whatever frame you're on. So let's enable that, and let's select our cone. Now because we didn't make any changes to the cone yet, no keyframes have been added. So I'm just going to simply press the G key and then press Enter without moving it anywhere. So that little change right there, or at least that attempted change, automatically inserted every keyframe for the cone. And you can tell a keyframe was added for the cone because the current frame number down here at the bottom of the 3D view is now orange. So let's go forward to frame 20 and just simply move the cone, rotate it, scale it, do whatever you want to it. And you don't need to manually insert a keyframe. You'll see that the current frame down here is now orange. Keyframes have automatically been inserted because of this record button. And now when you go through frame 1 to 20, you can see the animation for both the cube and the cone. We inserted the keyframes manually for the cube, but we did it automatically for the cone. So let's go to frame 40 and just move the cone again. See what happens. Scale it down. Just like that. Go back to frame 1, press Alt and A, and there's our fun little object animation. One thing you have to make sure you remember to do is when you are finished animating, make sure to turn off this record button. Because if you leave it on, you'll end up moving the object without even knowing it, and a keyframe is automatically inserted for it. So when you're done animating, make sure you disable the record button. Now that we've added some keyframes, let me show you where that data is stored. Let's pull the image window over a little bit. There's actually a couple windows that give you control over all the animation data. One is called the graph editor. So let's pull that up. Go into this menu here on the right side and select graph editor. So here's all of our animation curves. Every time you add a keyframe, it adds a curve into the graph editor. And this shows you all the animation curves for any object you have selected. Right now the cone's selected. Let us select the cube. You can see all the objects you have selected in the left column. So here we have the cube selected, and it shows us all the keyframes that we've added for the cube. So we've added location keyframes and rotation keyframes. And all of those curves are displayed on the right side here. Now we can manually modify all these curves to actually change the animation. For example, with the cube selected, if I zoom in to this red line here, and I select the keyframe on the left at frame 1, and you can tell what frame number it is by this vertical green line and the number at the bottom, which is frame 1. And the numbers at the bottom here is basically the timeline. It shows you all the frames. And the numbers on the left side here show you the values of all the keyframes. So by clicking in the middle of the keyframe at frame 1 for the red line, I've selected that keyframe. And now I can simply move this by pressing the G key. You'll see as I move it up or down, I'm changing the X value of the cube, and that's why you can see the cube moving in the 3D view. I know I'm changing the X value because this curve is red, which is the same color as the X-axis in the 3D view. So moving that up or down is going to change the X location. And the same thing holds true with all the other curves. Another way to move them, more precisely, would be to press the N key with that keyframe selected, and over here you can change the location of the keyframe by changing the frame number, and you can change its value by changing the value number. Let's get rid of that. Now it gets kind of messy with all the keyframes here because it's not just listing location keyframes, it's also listing the rotation keyframes. So let's hide the rotation keyframes by pressing this little icon right here. So now we're working with just 3 curves, X, Y, and Z location. And let me show you real quick how to bring these things into better view. You can zoom in and out with the middle mouse wheel. You can press the middle mouse button to pan it around. But you can also stretch it horizontally and vertically by holding the Control key, pressing the middle mouse button, and then dragging in any direction. So here I brought everything into view by kind of zooming and stretching it out a little bit. Now that we're zoomed in, you can notice how these curves kind of taper at the beginning and then also at the end. So basically when the animation starts, the cube's moving a little bit slower, and then it speeds up, and then it slows down before it stops at the end. This is a kind of interpolation called Bezier. There are a couple different kinds of interpolation. Let me show you all the different ones. So let's select all of the curves and all of the keyframes by pressing the A key once or twice until you see they're all selected. And then press the T key for the interpolation menu. Switch from Bezier to linear. And you'll see that all these curves now turned into sharp lines. So you can tell just by the way they look that they're going to maintain a constant speed. So if you press Alt and A over the 3D view, you'll see the cube moves from point A to point B at a constant speed. There's no tapering involved. So that's what linear interpolation is. Now press T again in the graph editor and change it to constant interpolation. You'll see that the cube is going to stay in the same location until the keyframe where it changes, and then it's just going to instantly move. So press Alt and A over the 3D view, and boom. You'll see it stays still until frame 20 where it moves. Now let's change that back to Bezier. In Bezier interpolation, you'll notice that there are 3 points for each keyframe. The middle point is the main keyframe point, but the ones on the sides are called handles. This can change the shape of the curve. So if we right-click on one of the handles here, you can press the G key and move that around, and you'll see that it's going to change the speed of the animation and the way the animation looks. So if I drag that all the way over there, you'll see when the animation starts, it spikes upward. So it's going to move pretty quickly, and then it's going to slow down until it stops. So press Alt and A, let's see what that looks like. You'll see it moved really quickly as soon as we started, and then it slowed down at the end until it stopped. Let me move that back. See what happens when we move it down here. So now it's going to stay put a little bit, and it's going to slowly start to move, and then it's going to move really quickly and then stop abruptly. Let's see how that looks. So that's how you can change the shape of Bezier curves using the handles. Now back in the left column, we can actually expand these options here by clicking on these arrows. So I just expanded the location keyframes, and it shows me the X curve, Y curve, and the Z curve. And we have some options here. With these options, we can click on any of these lock icons to prevent that curve from being changed at all. And we can also mute and unmute any of these actions. So for example, if I click on all of these speakers, I just unmuted all of those curves. I didn't delete them, I just made them inactive. So with those three keyframes muted, press Alt and A over the 3D and you'll see the cube doesn't move at all. It's because all of its location keyframes had been muted. So that's how those icons work. And with these options listed here, say we didn't want the cube to move on the y-axis, but we want it to move on the x and z-axis. So let's simply left-click on the y-location axis, or the y-location keyframe there, and press the delete key, and it's gone. Now the cube's only going to move on the x and z-axis. And of course you can press Ctrl and Z to undo that if you made a mistake. So from here, left-clicking on these also color-coded here so you know exactly which one is which. And you can also make them invisible with the eye icons. So that's the basics of using the graph editor. The other window that has animation data is called the dope sheet, which lists all of the objects in the scene that shows you their keyframe positions. So let's change the graph editor to the dope sheet. From here you can't modify the curves, but you can do things like speed up or slow down the animation for the entire scene, or individual elements in the scene. Or you can even move all of the keyframes to make an animation start sooner or later. So select all of the keyframes by pressing A once or twice until they're all selected, and then press the G key to move them. So I moved it over about 50 frames. Now the animation is going to start at frame 50. So press Alt and A over the 3D view, and you'll see there's a much bigger delay before the animation starts. That's because we moved all the keyframes over. We can select any keyframe by right-clicking on it. And we can select entire columns of keyframes by right-clicking on the top one. You can also use the B key for border select. Now let's make the animation slower by moving some keyframes around. So I'm going to select this first column of keyframes, and I'm going to move that back to around frame 1. And I'm going to select this last column of keyframes, move that far over to about frame 200. And I'm going to move this middle column in the middle of both of them. So we just stretched out the space between all of the keyframes, making our animation like 5-6 times longer. So press Alt and A over the 3D view, and let's see it animate very, very slowly now. So that's how we can control the speed of the animation for the entire scene, or just an object or two within the scene. I didn't have to move all of them. I could have simply chosen individual keyframes and moved that. So you can see how this editor gives you a lot of control over the speed and starting points and ending points of the animation. I'm going to move these all back close together. And by the way, you can also select all the keyframes and press the S key to scale them. And they'll scale based on the position of this vertical green line here. And you can move this green line by left-clicking and dragging, and it changes the current frame. So if you press S, you can stretch out the keyframes and make the animation slower, or you can even squish them closer together to make the animation much faster. Let me stretch that out a little bit more now so that it's back to normal. And one more thing that you can do is duplicate anything that you have selected. So if I have all of these keyframes selected, I can press Shift and D, which duplicates them, and then I can move that to the end just like that. And this will run the animation a second time after it finishes running the first time. So press Alt and A in the 3D view. You'll see the animation runs twice. This is extremely useful for things like walk cycles, where you'd only have to make a character walk 1 or 2 steps, and then you can duplicate that animation and just make it happen again and again and again and repeat forever if you want to make the character continue walking. The cool thing about it is, at the end of the first animation, it then moves back to the beginning of the next animation. So it smooths everything out for you. It doesn't just jump back into the beginning position of the next cycle of the animation. It moves back there. So we can continue duplicating this to make this happen as many times as we want. And it'll just keep playing over and over as many times as we duplicated it. So that's really good for things like walk cycles. And that's the basics of using the dope sheet. Now let's move on to some physics fundamentals. Now before we move on to the big exercise, I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to physics simulations. So open up physics-bowling.blend. The goal here is to have this bowling ball drop down onto this wooden ramp and crash into that bowling pin. And it's quite easy to make this happen. I mean, right now, if you press Alt and A to run the animation, nothing's happening. So let's add some physics properties to all the objects in the scene. With the bowling ball selected, go into the Properties window and go to the Physics buttons, which is this little white bouncing ball. Enable Rigid Body, and you can leave everything else the same. Press Alt and A and let's see what happens. Cool, the ball starts to drop. But of course it went through everything because nothing else has physics properties, so it's invisible to this ball. So select the wooden ramp, enable Rigid Body for that, and change its type from active to passive. Making it passive basically just makes it an obstacle, something to collide with. So let's press Alt and A again. Let's see what happens. Boom. Now the ball collides with this passive object and starts rolling down. I'm going to go into side view and zoom in wireframe view and start that simulation again. You'll see the ball is actually rolling down the ramp. It's not just simply sliding. Because the ramp has some friction to it, the ball is going to roll down instead of just slide. Alright, now that we got that working, let's select the ground and also add rigid body properties to that, and also change the type to passive. Press Alt and A again. Now it should roll down the ramp and then roll across the floor. Perfect. Last thing left is this little bowling pin. So let's select that bowling pin, add rigid body to that, and just leave everything as is. Leave it as active, leave dynamic enabled, leave everything there. Press Alt and A, let's see what happens. Perfect, crashes into the bowling pin. Doesn't do it with much force though. You would expect a bowling ball to have a little bit more mass than that, a little bit more momentum and power. So let's change that. Select the bowling ball, change its mass from 1 to 10. Press Alt and A to run the animation again. There we go. It hits the bowling ball with a lot more force, but everything's kind of moving very slowly. I want to speed everything up. And in order to do that, let's go to the scene buttons, which is this icon here with a sphere, a cylinder, and a little light. Click on that and scroll down to the rigid body world panel. Here you can change the speed of the simulation. Default is 1, but let's crank that up to 2. Press Alt and A, see the ball drops faster, smashes into the pin better, and everything just is simulating a lot faster now. Boom. That's perfect, I'd say. Let's make some more pins, shall we? In top view, I'm going to select that bowling pin, press Shift and D, and duplicate it in a bowling pin kind of pattern here. There we go. Press Alt and A and see how that works. Boom. And he gets a strike. And that's all there is to it. Adding simple physics is very simple.